All right, hey guys, I'm gonna get started. So, okay, cool. So today we have the pleasure of having guest speaker Mike McDonald coming in to speak to us. So I guess I've known Mike since freshman year of high school, before either of us knew what a flop turn river was. We met on the chess team. He was the captain of the chess team. And so since then, Mike's gone on to win over $4.5 million in live tournaments and is an extremely reputable member online as well. And he coached the World Series of Poker main event winner from last year and is extremely reputable as a coach. So, and Mike, he's also the youngest player to win a World Poker Tour. So he actually stole that title from me. So I had that title until Mike, he was more than a year younger than me, stole it from me. So without further ado, let's give a round of applause to Mike.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Will. It's really good to see so many people coming out for this class, and it's good to be here again this year. Will was telling me that a lot of the lectures so far have been like very, very theoretical, and wanted me to do a more practical lecture, like going through a lot of hands that I've played and give a lot of examples as to why I made the decisions that I did. If you guys have any questions, don't be afraid to put your hand up. That definitely contributes a lot to the discussion, and I'd rather be talking back and forth than just listening to myself talk. So basically, the main focus of this lecture is going to be bet sizing. Will was saying in a lot of the home game tournaments you guys have been playing, a lot of people, some situations are betting too much or betting too little, or people are emailing them questions where they're not really sure what factors they should be looking at when it comes to sizing their bets. So all of my all the examples I give will come down to how to analyze the various aspects of a hand as far as trying to come up with how large you want to bet in the hand you play. So as far as so essentially in this lecture I'll be discussing 5 major factors. The first one, which is far and away the simplest, is just how large the pot is. Fortunately, when you play online, it's displayed right on your screen, so this one's pretty simple. And then additionally, what we need to think about, we need to think about like what we have. When people think about, like most people, when they think about what they have as a hand, they focus too much on what their hand is and not enough on what the board is. That's something I'll get into later. The third thing is how large is our stack. This is something, the absolute value of your stack doesn't matter. What really matters is the relative value, not relative to the opponents, but relative to the pot. So when referring to how large your stack is, I'll always be referring to that in terms of pot size bets, which is essentially how many times the pot you have. If the pot has 1,000 chips and you have 5,000, then you have 5 pot size bets. If it has 1,000 chips, you have 1,000, you have 1 pot size bet, and that's essentially how I'll be describing your stack size. The other thing I'll be talking about, the fourth factor, is what our opponent likely has. Essentially, that's the goal of poker, is trying to figure out what your opponent has and how to make the right decision. That's obviously the most complicated of the 5 factors, and essentially the object of the game. Basically, in a couple of the examples, I'll be going over how I, tried to figure out what they have and then catered my bet sizing to that. And then the 5th factor, which is something that's also extremely relevant, is what your opponent would think you have. In a lot of situations where your opponent may think you're particularly strong or particularly weak, you need to make substantial adjustments to how you otherwise may have sized the bet as a way of catering to that and taking full advantage of your opponent. So now going back to it, the first factor, which I'll be able to go over fairly quickly, is simply just how much is in the pot. Like when you're playing online, they keep track of the pot size for you. When you're playing in person, I think it's pretty good, especially like when you're first starting, to try to keep track of like literally exactly how many chips are in the pot. Obviously, it might not matter whether there's $40 in the pot or $41 in the pot. That's not actually going to change how you're going to size your bet substantially when it's only 2.5% difference. But one thing that does is it just, when you're trying to keep track of the exact pot size, it's useful just to ensure that you're always paying full attention and getting the most information you can get. So keeping track of the pot size is important. And then what happens as far as how a lot of players, when they figure out bet sizing, they've kind of figured out what they're doing, they want to. Well, the first thing a lot of people do, they just start out. They bet strong when they have a good hand, and then they bet like weak when they have a weak hand. Like they bet big when they're trying to get a lot of money out of the guy. They bet a little when they're trying to get a little money out of the guy, or just try to make him fold. And then once they get a little bit better, what they tend to do is they realize, hey, wait a sec. If I'm if I'm having these exploitable tendencies as far as how much I'm betting, people are going to take advantage of that. So then what you need to do as a result of that is try to cater your bet sizing in a way that gives up as little information as possible while acquiring you as much value as possible. So what happens is some people, what they do is they get so afraid of giving away information that they always bet the exact same percent of the pot. Whatever the board is, whatever the size of the pot, they always bet, say, half the pot, or they always bet 2/3 of the pot, or they always bet full pot. And what ends up happening there is, on the one hand, like, yes, you are balanced, and no one's going to end up taking advantage of you in the sense that they're going to know what you have based on how much you're betting. But on the other hand, you're not going to be taking advantage of what the board is, or what the stack size dynamic are, or any of the other factors you can use there. So essentially what I would argue is that, and what I think most poker players would argue, is that the way you should cater your bet sizing is in a way that basically combines maximizing your own value with minimizing the amount of information you're giving up. So essentially what that means is the later you are in a hand, if you're on the river, people will have less opportunities to take advantage of the information you're giving them. So generally you can give away more information on the river than you'd want to give away pre-flop. If you give away information about the strength of your hand pre-flop, then people have 3 or 4 or more decisions later on where they can utilize that information against you. If you have exploitable bet sizing on the river, they'll only be able to exploit you on the river. So essentially trying to keep your bet sizing as balanced as possible for as long as possible is pretty good. But then basically, as far as the situations where you'd want to deviate from your standard bet sizing, that's when the information you'll utilize is information your opponent already has. So as an example, on certain boards, you'll want to bet a larger percentage of pot. On certain boards, you'll want to bet a lower percentage of pot. With certain stack sizes, it'll be different. And that's essentially what this lecture is mostly going to cover. I'm just going to go over a bunch of examples for how one would use that information. So essentially the next slide is just talking about how how you, by changing your bet sizing, you can take advantage of your opponent in those situations, whereas your opponent won't be taking full advantage of you if they're just always betting the same percentage of the pot. So now basically one sec, I think I might be on the wrong side. Okay, so anyways, basically the gist of number 2 is that when we're talking about what we have, especially early on in the hand, what we have refers to more, what are the cards that we have on the board more so than what are the cards in our hand. And then as we get to the later streets, then we'll likely deviate our bet sizing based on the strength of our hand and less on what's on the board. So essentially, I'll get into the first hand. So the first hand here, we raise with pocket sevens from under the gun, 2.5x. We get a call from Rosagas, and we also get a call from Mora 7777. The flop comes 10 of hearts, 9 of hearts, 8 of hearts, which is essentially about as coordinated of a board as you can possibly have. Generally, when people are involved in a hand, they're going to have cards, that are, often suited and connected and relatively big, which is exactly what this board is. Anytime they have an 8, a 9, or a 10 in their hand, they'll have a pair. Anytime they have a jack or a 7 in their hand, they'll have a straight draw. Anytime they have a queen or 6 in their hand, they'll have a gut shot straight draw. And anytime they have a heart in their hand, they'll have a flush draw. We have a little bit of all of that. We've got a pair, we've got a weak straight draw, and we've got a weak flush draw that's also a straight flush draw. So essentially here, this is a hand where, this looks like our hand's a lot better than it is. Like right now, one of these guys will have a better hand than us the vast majority of the time. They'll either have an 8 or a pocket pair or a straight or something like that. But the thing about this hand is that even if they have a very strong hand, we'll have a good chance to beat them. Like say they have, pocket tens for 3 of a kind, we can hit one of 9 hearts or one of 8 straight cards. 2 of those are double counted, so we still have 15 cards to beat a hand like top set. And the vast majority of hands, we have a decent chance of beating them. The other issue with this hand is that even though our hand does very well against the very good hands, it does, say quite poorly against some relatively poor hands. Like let's just say our opponent has like, I don't know, Jack 3 offsuit or something like that. Against a hand like Jack 3 offsuit, they can still win if they hit like any 7 or queen, and say they had Jack 3 offsuit with the Jack of hearts, they're winning probably 40% of hands when they can also win with the vast majority of hearts except the 6 of hearts. So essentially what ends up happening here is we have a pretty good semi-bluffing hand in the sense that we probably don't have the best hand, but most of the time, unless they have a flush essentially, we have a hand which can win a decent percent of the time. So now here, if someone were to use that typical smaller betting and bet, 40% pot, 50% pot, like 100 chips or 120 chips into 240, they're not going to get many people to fold, and then as a result, they're just not going to win the pot a very large percent of the time. Additionally, if you have, say, a stronger hand here, like say you have 3 of a kind 8s, you want to be able to bet larger to prevent people getting cheaper cards when they have, a hand like the one we do. So essentially on this board, we wouldn't bet with that many hands, but what we end up doing is we bet 3/4 of the pot. So 3/4 of the pot here, essentially what that's aimed to do is when he has a hand like, when one of our opponents like Rostigas or Mora has a hand like King 9, something like King 9 would be about even or maybe a slight statistical favorite over us, or something like Ace Jack, which we might be about 60% against, but we'd still rather them fold than have them call and recognize that equity that they have. So the goal of this bet is to fold out a lot of those hands that perform similarly to us, but aren't necessarily great hands in themselves. And then as the hand plays out, we get called by one opponent. Now the turn comes a king. The king is a card that can help either opponent, or it can help either player. Like from his perspective, all the strong hands, like if we have a straight, if we have a flush, if we have 3 of a kind, we can still have all those hands. And additionally, there are some hands we could have now where he might feel he's in worse shape. Like for example, say he thought we have a hand like, say he has something like pocket jacks, and we have, and he was thinking we might have the ace of hearts in our hand or the king of hearts in our hand. Now if he has pocket jacks and we had, king queen with the king of hearts or something, now he goes from having the best hand where we need to hit a king, a jack, or a heart to beat him, to a hand where he needs to hit a queen or a 7 to win. So he would go from being a slight statistical favorite to a giant statistical underdog with a lot of his hands. So basically, and there aren't that many hands where he had a mediocre hand on the flop called and now is a very strong hand. Like something like if he had king 10, that would be a big improvement, but most of his hands won't be improved that much, and they probably improve us a little more. So here I elect to make a bigger bet again. I bet 420 here. It's just 70% of the pot. And again, this 70% of the pot I think it'll fold out a lot of his stronger one pair hands, and it also has the potential. It's big enough that if he has something like just the ace of hearts, like if he has the ace of hearts with a queen or something, it's a large enough bet that he may end up folding to this. And I think if he had something like the ace queen with the queen of hearts, where he's maybe afraid we have the ace of hearts, then he's extremely likely to fold. And then as it was, he called. We rivered a mediocre flush where essentially any heart he's going to have will probably beat us, since he's not that likely to have the 3 of hearts or the 2 of hearts or something like that. At this point, we're in a situation where we're likely mostly beating bluffs, but if we had the opportunity to fold out some of his like jack of hearts type hands, when he then bets a large percent of pot on the river, he's kind of saying, look, I've got the ace of hearts or I don't. As it was, I thought he didn't have the ace of hearts and he didn't. But that's not too relevant, since it was essentially the focus of this lesson is mostly just like how we decided to bet things. The next hand will be one that's kind of an opposite type of board, where so on the previous example was one where the board hits everything. Now I'm going to go over a hand where the board doesn't really connect with, a single thing. In this hand, it folds around to piece kata, and he raises. I have jacks on the button and decide to re-raise. With this hand here, I'm pretty comfortable just getting all in against him. When he's in late position, jacks figure to be a pretty substantial favorite, and I only have 25 times the big blind. So I'm just re-raising here, planning to call an all in. It folds back to him, and he now just calls. So now here's a situation where when he just calls here, most of the time he'll have something decent, but something not that great. Like he'll have, with most of his similar quality hands, like something like larger pocket pairs, or big cards like, ace queen, ace jack, like just stronger big card hands, he probably would have just been going all in here. So usually when he calls, the first things I'd put him on would be, medium Broadway type hands, like a king queen, ace 10, king jack, hands like that, or some decent suited connectors, like a 10-9 suited, jack 10 suited, a lot of hands like that. Essentially, the vast majority of the time he's going to have worse than jacks. Often he'll have some small pocket pairs, but I would have thought with pocket pairs he'd usually be going all in or folding. So I would have thought he mostly has big card type hands. Here the flop comes 8-2-2, which is about as harmless of a flop as you can possibly get. The one thing, so on this flop, essentially what happens is whoever had the strongest absolute value hand pre-flop will still have the strongest hand, unless like the rare event where one person has a 2 or an 8. I mean, it's extremely unlikely that either of us have a 2, especially unlikely that he has a 2 when he just called my re-raise. Like for me, I could re-raise ace 2 suited or king 2 suited or something if I felt like doing that. But for the most part, when he's calling, it's a fairly big mistake to continue with something like that. So he rarely will have a 2 here. And then he can have an 8 if he had something like 9-8 suited or ace 8 suited. Some of those hands will occasionally call. But basically on a board like this, probably 85 to like low 90% of the time, whoever had the stronger hand pre-flop will still have the stronger hand. And on top of that, whoever had the stronger hand pre-flop, their equity will have increased, and the person who had the weaker hand, their equity will have decreased. So, say I was up against a hand like a king jack, which is something that I think would be a fairly likely hand for him. Pre-flop, I would have been about 70% to win. Now after a safe flop like this, I'm closer to like probably about 85% to win. So what that essentially means now is that whoever's ahead is ahead by more, and the turn is likely not going to change very much. Like even if he had a hand, like say, like there's probably one of the hands that would be the most likely to improve would be something like if he had 10-9 of diamonds or something. With 10-9 of diamonds, he simply has 10 high right now, but then he has 10 cards which will give him a flush draw. He has namely any diamond. He has a jack or a 7, which is 6 more cards, which will give him a straight draw. Then he has 6 cards which will give him a pair. But even with a hand like that, still the vast majority of the time, he'll end up with the worst hand on the turn, he'll improve his equity on a large number of cards, but he won't actually improve to a better hand on anything besides the 10 or the 9. So what that essentially means is when that's about one of the most coordinated hands he can have, you can bet very, very small on a board like this and achieve the same goal as with a larger bet. So something like in that previous example where I was betting 75% of the pot, if I stuck to that as, a hard and fast rule, I was always going to bet 75% of the pot. Here I'd be betting, roughly 17,000 into this 23,000 chip pot. And essentially a large amount of the time he'll be going all in or folding when I could have just bet 7,000 or 6,000, and then he'll often be all in or folding as well. So essentially when I have jacks, it doesn't really matter that much, but when I have a bluff, I'll save myself 10,000 chips by betting as it was, I bet 6,600. If I had to bet, say, 16,000 into the pot, if he went all in and I had to fold a bluff, then it would just cost me that much more. So essentially, when you're in a spot where you have the initiative and the board is unlikely to improve him, betting extremely small will often accomplish this, like the same amount of goals the same amount of positive goals as a larger bet, and when things go poorly for you, it won't be as negatively. Right, so now the next one I'll be talking about is how much is in our stack. Again, just one more reminder, I'll be referring to this in terms of pot size bets. If you have 1,000,000 chips versus 1,000 chips, it doesn't really matter if in one example the pot's 100,000, the other the pot's 100. You just need to think about what your stack size is in terms of the pot, and that's generally what dictates your decision rather than the physical number of pieces of plastic in front of you or numbers on a screen. Basically, what happens is as far as like leveraging your stack size, as you get shorter and shorter, it's valuable to know how many bets it will take for you to get all in or to give the threat of going all in. So as an example, in this one I have up here, we could, like, when the flop comes 8-2-2, I can decide I want to get all in one bet, 2 bets, or 3 bets. So if I want to get all in one bet, I can just go all in on this flop. And then essentially what I'm doing there is I'm trying to take down the pot. He'll call me if he has something decent. He'll fold if he doesn't, and that plays the hand out in the simplest way possible. But it kind of negates the advantage of being able to acquire the information, which is the goal of the game. If you want to turn it into a 2-bet hand, you can bet something like a little bit smaller, like maybe bet 10,000 on this flop, which would be a little under 50% of the pot, and then 31,000 on the turn, which would be about 3/4 of the pot. That's an option to turn it into a 2-bet hand. And then as a 3-bet hand, you can do something smaller, like bet 6,000 on the flop, 10,000 on the turn. So quarter pot on the flop, a quarter pot on the turn, and then you'll still have about 25,000 left, and the pot will have around 55,000, and then you'll bet slightly less than half pot on the river. And essentially there, what you're doing is you're allowing yourself the opportunity to make the most decisions as possible during the hand, and then be able to hopefully take advantage of your opponent as much as possible. Basically, the other thing that's valuable is that a lot of times your opponent, it's like, say in this example where I bet 6,000 on the flop and he calls me, a lot of times he's calling there thinking to himself, all right, well, if he goes all in on the turn, I can just fold, as like a hypothetical example. By being able to give yourself more options and more bets, basically if he's like playing that sort of fit or fold style where he's calling once and folding to future aggression, it allows you to it exploits that strategy more. If he's doing that, you can just bet smaller on subsequent streets and be able to just sort of essentially punish people for playing hands out of position more. And then on the opposite end, as far as leveraging your stack size, as far as the stack to pot ratio, when you're in position in poker, you have a large advantage. Essentially, you're always half a street ahead of them, if that makes sense. Basically, when the turn gets dealt and you're out of position, you can either bet or you can check. When you're in position, you can bet or check, but you've already seen whether they've bet or checked, so you have the information as to their reaction, and you can also determine whether future money is going in on the current street, or whether you're, say, going to wait to the river to put more money in. So essentially, the fact that you have that advantage, both as far as the information and then the ability to utilize that information on subsequent streets, means that as stacks get deeper, you can exploit this more and more. When stacks are very shallow, you don't have that much information. You don't have that much ability to do that, since you'll be getting all in a lot. When stacks get extremely deep, these larger bet sizes like that, when the stack to pot ratio is higher, allows you to take that information advantage and use it to earn more chips. So now I'll go over a hand where there was a large stack to pot ratio. So here we have a hand. It folds around to honest Pete on the button. The blinds are 40-80 in this tournament. He makes it 160. I re-raise him to 560 with ace-8 suited, and he calls. The flop is pretty similar to the previous one. It comes 10-9-7 with 2 diamonds and 1 club. So now this is a board here where essentially pre-flop, when I re-raised him and he just called, on average, my hands will be a little bit stronger than his hands will be. Like I'll have more, ace king, ace queen, ace jack type hands, and he'll have more, ace 10, king queen, king jack, like jack 10, like middling type hands. Also, as far as pairs, I'll have more tens and better type pairs. He'll have more jacks through sixes type pairs. Essentially, the reason behind that is, with a lot of his stronger hands, he would have put in a 4-3 raise, and we can discount a large, we can discount a lot of hands like pocket aces since he didn't throw out that additional re-raise. Whereas for me, in the first place, I would have wanted to call with some of my like medium strength hands where I wouldn't want to be uncomfortable if he threw out that fourth raise. So basically, pre-flop, I'll usually on average have slightly stronger hands than him, but this flop on average connects with the hands he'll have better than it does for me. Essentially, with my hand, in general, I'll do better when the board has like more aces, kings, and queens. He'll do better when it has more like jacks through sevens type hands, jack through seven type cards, sorry. And basically what that means is that a board like this will improve his chances with the majority of his hands more than it will for me. So what happens here is with a large number of my hands, like, if I have something like ace queen on this board, essentially I'm just hoping to hit an ace or a queen, and even if I do, he may have like a two pair type hand. I don't have that many opportunities to really make a strong hand. With this hand, it's actually like with ace 8 suited, I actually got a fairly fortunate flop for it. I have, well, first of all, any jack or six gives me a straight. Additionally, if it comes a king or a queen, which would have been some of my better cards for my overall range, I can represent an ace king type hand. And then also if it comes running clubs, I can hit a flush. So basically on this flop, since I don't have that many hands I'll be betting with, like with a lot of my ace king, ace queen hands, I'd just be checking. Then when I do have a good hand, I want to make sure that when he has king queen or he has jack 10 or he has a hand that's either it's either got a decent draw on the flop or it's like a middle pair or a weak top pair type hand that he's put in more uncomfortable situations. Say I were to do that like 1/3 pot betting, essentially I bet 400 on the flop and then 700 on the turn or something. Basically what will end up happening is he'll have so much more information as far as the cards that are coming out and how I react to them, that he'll just kind of own me. Like as well as I try to play the hand, he'll just be able to use that half street advantage I was talking about to be able to just make better decisions than I will. So essentially the way to negate that is to try to maintain a relatively strong range yourself on a board like this and bet relatively large as a way of charging him for staying in the pot. As it is, I bet about 2/3 of the pot here. I bet 777 into 1200. Sorry, I'm really like OCD with my bet sizing. I always do the same number again, or like a staircase bet where it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or something. It's never just a normal 800 or anything. But basically, he calls here, which I would have expected him to do with the majority of his hands. I think if he had any 10, 9, or 7, he'll call. If he had any 8 in his hand, he'll probably call. And really, even something like, say a card like a jack on its own isn't that great of a hand, but any hand he'd be continuing with a jack in it, he's probably going to call the flop with. If he has, obviously jack 10 or jack 9 or jack 8, hands like that, he'll be continuing. And if he has queen jack, he has an open-ended straight draw, and that like any king or 8 will give him a straight. If he has king jack, he has a double gut shot straight draw, and that any queen or 8 will give him a straight. And then if he has something like an ace jack, where it's just a gut shot, he may sometimes fold that, but still, the vast majority, something like ace jack looks like it misses that board, and he's still, somewhat likely to continue. So even against my larger bet, I'm not at all surprised that he called it. Turn is the 6 of diamonds, which is it's a fairly good card for me. He can still, very easily have, any of a wide variety of flushes. He could still have something like a jack 8, but, more often he'll have something like, like a top pair or maybe like a straight draw with a diamond or something like that. And basically here, some people when they hit a big hand, they'll then revert to smaller bet sizing, thinking, all right, I was trying to bluff him out on the flop with that larger bet. Now I want to keep him in the pot. As it is, if he has like say he had a hand like a ace jack with a diamond, if you bet 1,000 or something like that into 3,000 here, something like ace jack with a diamond will win if it hits any 8 or any diamond. So that's 12 cards when there's 44 left in the deck. so he only needs to win, like he wins roughly a little under 30% of the time. So as long as he's getting more than 2.5 to 1 odds, he can call profitably, assuming you're going to make equally good decisions on the river. So basically and that's not even a particularly strong draw or anything like that. So with a lot of his hands, he'll be able, he'll want to continue with them. So even though we have the straight here, it still makes sense when the stack to pot ratio is still over 4 to make a relatively large bet. If hypothetically we were to bet the full pot here, and he were to call, and we were to bet the full pot on the river, we still wouldn't be all in. And that just kind of shows, in the previous example I was talking about betting, a quarter of the pot, then the third of the pot, then half the pot. Here, there is opportunity to bet substantially larger. So as it was, I bet 1888, which is again right around 2/3 of the pot this time, and he calls as well. The river comes in ace, which is which is a card that basically it doesn't really change anything, but essentially what the ace does as far as perceptions is that a lot of times on the turn, when he calls the turn, I think he's kind of broken down into, I'll say, about 3 types of hands. The first type of hand will be just strong hands, hands 2 pair, sets, straights, flushes, hands that are similar strength to us and just powerful hands overall. The second will be hands where he had kind of a nothing hand he was drawing to, something like Queen Jack with a diamond, or even Queen Jack without a diamond is something that will likely call there was a straight draw or flush draw combination, where those hands are fairly weak and obviously not calling a river bet. Even with some of the stronger hands in the first part, with flushes, he's going to be at least calling, often raising this river, and then with some of his 2 pair hands, he may be folding the river. And now with some of his other hands, and this is the most relevant segment of his range of hands, would be that this ace changes, is if he has something like a king 10 or a pocket jacks or something like that. When he called the turn, he was calling because he thinks his hand is good. He thinks I'm bluffing with an ace king or an ace queen or something like that, maybe with a diamond. Now when this ace comes, when I check the river, his perception is often that he was calling the turn because he thought his top pair with king 10 or his over pair with pocket queens was the best hand. Now when this ace comes, he's trying to think through the hands I could possibly have, and a lot of people will then think that I'm likely to have an ace jack or I'm likely to have an ace queen, which is has now rivered them and is a top pair hand, but still not a particularly strong hand, when I know that such a large segment of his range is those stronger 2 pair hands, straight hands, flush hands. So this ace, despite not really changing my hand very much and rarely changing his hand, kind of changes his perception of what my weaker hands will be, and he'll often think some of my weaker hands beat his weaker hands now, which means that he'll turn a lot of them into a bluff. So with something like a king 10, which he'd often check the river back with, I think there's now at least a chance he'll bluff with it, which is why I checked this river. As it was, all that thinking was kind of for nothing, because he had exactly that type of hand and did check back the river. So that was my thought process for the hand. In this example, it wasn't really checking. If I bet extremely small on the river, maybe he would have called something like that. Like if I bet 1/10 of the pot or something against that specific hand. But in general, I think in this example you'll get a decent number of people who will bluff in these spots when they're trying to essentially bluff out your bluffs. All right, now I'm going to go back to that first hand, since that's also a useful hand for talking about hands with a smaller stack to pot ratio. So as it was, as I was talking about, on this flop we have 1.8 times the pot. As I mentioned, you can play this as a 1 street hand and go all in for 1.8 times the pot. I think that on a board like this, doing that with any hand is pretty much a mistake. There are some boards where, on slightly more coordinated boards, where you're trying to achieve a more specific goal, there are plenty of times where you can do that, but on this board, I think any hand you shouldn't be doing that with. With this hand, as some examples of what we could do if we wanted to play it as a 2-bet hand, we could bet 25% on the pot on the flop, and he would call, in which case we'd have 35,000 left each, and there would be 23 plus 6 plus 6 in the pot, so 35 in the pot, and we could bet 100% of pot on the turn, or we could bet 40% of pot on the flop, like 9,000, get called. There's 41,000 in the pot, 32,000 in effective stacks, and then be able to bet about 75 or 80% on the turn. So those are examples for what we could do as a 2-street hand. As a 3-street hand, we do something more along the lines of quarter pot, half pot, which really kind of forces him into the most uncomfortable situations, I guess. So I bet a quarter pot on the flop, and he calls. The turn is an 8, which is a card that really, it looks more threatening than it is. I mean, essentially now, if he has an 8, he went from being a massive underdog against me to a massive favorite against me. But essentially, when I was going through this hand initially, pre-flop he doesn't have that many hands with an 8 in, and additionally, when there's 2 8s out there, like combinatorically, there's only half as many ways he can have an 8 now, and there's only 2 of them left as opposed to 4. So it's again just something that's decently unlikely, and most likely in this situation, when he just calls that small bet, I would say he's still probably the most likely to have something like a 2 big cards type hand, like an ace 10 or like a king jack type thing, where he just called because he was getting a good price. And then I would say the second most likely thing would be for him to have some sort of pocket pair. I think if he has a pocket pair, it certainly could be something like aces that he just slow played on the flop and was really trying to trap me. I mean, I think it's that like 5% of the time or something, but it's still a consideration. And then other than that, I would say his other pocket pairs he would have would just be 2s through 6s type hands. In this spot I was thinking like ace jack or something would be the thing I'd be like most think he'd be most likely to have, but the smaller pairs I would say would be the second most likely thing. When it comes to betting the turn, this is actually a hand where I was kind of like, it's kind of finicky, but I feel like I bet unnecessarily big on this turn. So here I had about one times the pot back. I bet a third of the pot, which would leave me with effectively 2/5 of the pot if you were to call for the river. Basically here, even though 1/3 of the pot is by no means a giant bet, it's actually quite a small bet. In this specific situation, I can bet substantially smaller and essentially achieve the same goals. If he has either of those types of hands I was talking about, like a 6s or an ace 10 type hand, getting him to call 8,000 or 9,000 on the turn is similarly valuable to me as calling 12,000. But also, I think it's more likely to get him to check raise and then be able to get the full double up for all 34,000 chips. I think this larger bet, I think a quarter pot bet would be a little more effective than a third pot bet here, since it kind of like when he's like looking through the odds of things. If he puts me all in, there would be he'd put in 35,000. There's 35,000 in the pot, so like 36, 71, plus this 12,000 here, a total of like 83,000, and I'm only calling about 22 more. So in his mind, when I'm getting roughly 4 to 1 odds, 3.5 to 1 odds or so, it's he might think I'm calling this with almost anything, whereas when I bet slightly smaller and I'm getting maybe slightly under 3 to 1 odds, he might think that he has a little more room for fold equity and therefore might try to like bluff me off of this a little more often. As it was, he went for it anyways against my like slightly larger bet, and I was able to hold against his pocket 4s. And now the next one that we'll be talking about is essentially the most interesting question.
Yeah, just so for context, is this a tournament or a cash game?
Oh yeah, sorry. So it shows dollar signs beside all the questions, but these are all tournament hands. Yeah. Effectively, tournament hands versus cash game hands. The main difference largely is that in tournaments people will be more risk averse to these larger decisions than they would be in a cash game. Like in a cash game, most people are more able to just think about it, analytically, and just think, is this like a positive expectation play, and try to make the right play. In tournament environments, people get irrationally attached to their tournament life, which is why bet sizing will be so important, and the number of streets and the threat of going all in matters a lot more, because when someone loses an all in the cash game, they're often just buying back in, whereas in the tournament they have that irrational side to the decision, which allows you to take advantage of that.
One other quick question.
Yep.
And so for like when you're spreading your bets out like over 3 streets,
Yeah.
it seems like you're increasing the volatility when you only started with, you said 25 big bets.
Yeah. it's
So like when you decide to say, okay, I'm going to take the pot down and improve my position versus trying to like maximize long term.
yeah. So basically, by having the smaller bets there, you basically it largely depends on the exact situation. Usually, I think in that situation it largely can actually decrease your volatility just in the sense that you have a lot more 5 to 8 big blind swings, but you have substantially less 25 big blind swings. Like essentially on the going back to the previous hand, like say on the turn we're deciding whether to go all in as a bluff or not. When we're let's just say we have a crappy hand here like 4-3 offsuit or something that's never going to win if called. Basically, when we're deciding what to do on the turn, what we need to when we're determining whether to bluff this turn, we need to think to ourselves, is this going to work more than half the time? Like we're risking 35,000 to win 36,000. So effectively, if it works more than 49 or 48% of the time, it's a profitable bluff. If not, it's an unprofitable bluff. Whereas say we're betting that 9,000 mod I recommended, we're betting 9,000 to win 36,000. So effectively, as long as that works more than 20% of the time, it's a profitable bluff, which is something like as far as the weaker hands, you give your the difference between the bluff needing to work 50% versus 20% is pretty massive. Like even if he's going to continue with some bluffs a little bit more, it's probably not going to be 30% of his total hands in the majority of situations. So the fact that let's just say hypothetically he would have folded to the all-in 60%, but he'll fold to the small bet 40%. The all-in will be profitable, but the smaller bet will be profitable as well. And essentially getting yourself in a in a large number of situations where you can pick up pots by not risking that much can prove to be fairly valuable. It definitely means in the short term you'll have a lot of situations like say you bet that on the turn you bet that 8,000, that 4 big blinds, and he goes all in as a bluff, and you fold and he shows you the bluff and you feel kind of stupid. Like that definitely happens, and that happens more times than I can count. But basically, substantially more times it happens where you win pots that you win pots for cheaper, or in the event that you do run into a hand, you cost yourself 4 big blinds instead of 17 big blinds. So that's kind of the general idea. Like I do agree. In most situations, the all-in bluff will work a larger number of times, but it largely comes down to just risk management. Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm speaking more as like the entire part of your range. Like with this specific hand, we obviously want to get the money in, but basically in every situation, what I'm trying to think about is the types of hands I could have here, and when I do have a bluff here, making sure that basically on top of having a bluff, you want to be able to have the threat of a bluff, I guess. So yeah, in this spot here, if he has something decent, the money is probably going in anyways, and it still is. Say he's calling and he's just afraid of an ace coming off. There's let's just say he called this turn as opposed to going all in, and he was just he really thought I had an ace in my hand. He's going to fold if an ace comes. The ace is only coming on the river 3 out of 44 times. Like it's only going to be so that will be 7% of the time that I do lose the remaining chips I get, but there still are there are the additional times when he pays off on other cards. There are the additional times that I induce him to bluff check raise. So I mean, there are basically when you have these boards. So a board like this, essentially on a super dry board, whoever has the best hand has the best hand by a lot. So kind of that's a situation where you can utilize that positional advantage more, and basically just decide I'm going you don't know if I'm betting the river, you don't know if I'm checking the river, you don't know if I'm calling your turn shove. You just have there's so many unknowns for them, and when you get to react to everything after they do, it's just a big advantage for you. So trying to bask in that for as long as possible on average is pretty good. On the more coordinated boards, let's just say hypothetically I got that 10-9-7 2 diamond board in this exact hand. So probably on the flop, probably there I would have decided to turn it into a 2 street hand rather than the 3 street hand. So say instead of 8-2-2 rainbow, we got the 10-9-7 2 diamonds 1 club. There I'd probably bet something like a 9,000 or a 10,000, which would let me still have my bluffs there, which I could fold to a check raise on the flop. But then on the turn, we'd end up having roughly 30,000 in the pot, maybe like 30, yeah, around 30,000. No, more than that. We'd end up having like 42,000 in the pot and like 31,000 behind. Then you'd be able to go all in on the vast majority of turns, and then you'll get called by a lot of worse hands. You'll also have other goals that you accomplish that are good, like say someone has, I don't know, something like a king queen or something like that. Maybe they'll call the flop on 10-9-7 and fold the turn, in which case you're folding out there like 5 or 6 cards which could have beaten you, and basically there would be something where whenever anything he could have has a decent chance against you, then you have more incentive to knock him out of the pot and take your winnings now and kind of limit the volatility. Because if you did have, say you bet super small on the turn, if it's 10-9-7, the turn comes, a queen or something, and you bet really small. Now when he calls, so many rivers are going to just be really gross rivers. Like any king jack 8 or 6 will put at least 4 to a straight out there. Any ace will kill action. Any board pairing card will kill action. Like if the flush gets there, now that'll kill action. Like so at that point, it's probably 50-60% of the deck are cards that might mean you don't get paid off. Whereas on a board like this, say with his pocket fours he decided to call. I mean, as it was, the river was an ace, so let's say he was doing that strategy of, call anything but an ace, fold on the ace. We would have lost it in this specific instance, but that still is just, 6 or 7% type occurrence. So yeah, for the more that the board suggests that the person who's in front is a high equity favorite, the less important it is to get all in now. And then and as you'll see in like one of the hands I talk about later, when there's a board where the person who's a favorite isn't a giant favorite, then it is more important to get all in now and either push your equity advantage and say, hey, look, I'm 70% to win. You can either call my all in and I'm going to win the pot 70%, or you can fold and I'm going to win the money that's out there 100%. So does that kind of answer the general question? All right, cool. And if you guys have more questions, it definitely helps with the discussion. So.
Yeah, I think we should take a 5-minute break.
5-minute break? All right, sweet. Sounds good. Should I pause this? Or?
Yeah, I'll pause it.
All right.
Sorry.
No worries.
I should tell you.
No problem.
Because they track attendance, so.